What about Ukraine's allies? What do they plan to do until then? What kind of steps are they mulling against Russia? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my colleagues, our correspondents from 4 capitals shaping this conflict. We have Simon Marks with us from Washington, D.C., Giles Gibson from Moscow, Rosie Burchett from Brussels, and Chris Jones from London. Hello to all of you. Simon, let's start with you. Joe Biden has vowed to hold Russia accountable. How exactly?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it, Palki? Because we know what he's not going to do. The White House was very clear about that yesterday. He's absolutely not going to put American troops on the ground in Ukraine to defend the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki insisted yesterday that he's not going to allow himself to be drawn into a war with Russia. So while there's talk out there in the ether now about the prospect of trying to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine in a bid to stop Moscow's aerial bombardment of the country, how on earth could you possibly enforce that without running the risk of being precisely drawn into armed conflict with the Russians? So what the president is expected to announce here today are more sanctions, and he's under enormous pressure to fling every sanction in his arsenal at Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, and quite possibly at Vladimir Putin personally. It's evident that what the Americans unveiled earlier in the week, the sanctioning of a couple of Russian financial institutions and a handful of Russian oligarchs, in no way deterred Vladimir Putin from launching this full-scale attack on Ukraine. Will the White House now perhaps personally sanction the Russian leader himself? They insisted yesterday that option was still on the table. Will they sanction Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and all the other bureaucrats who dutifully lined up and gave Vladimir Putin their blessing in that sort of North Korean-style National Security Council meeting that was televised in Moscow earlier in the week? And what happens if sanctions aren't enough? What will the United States do if the Russians succeed in unseating the Ukrainian government, deposing Volodymyr Zelensky, and taking control of the country by force? It is very unclear at this point what the United States is willing to do beyond sanctions. And
sanctions, as we've discussed in the past, have not deterred Vladimir Putin. Giles, tell us about the developments in Moscow. Any indications as to how long Russia plans to continue this offensive?
We've had an update in the last few hours from Dmitry Peskov, who is President Putin's official spokesperson, describing some of the aims here of this Russian offensive. He said the aim is the demilitarization of Ukraine. He also talked about the neutralization of military potential inside the country, and he was asked about the timing here, how long this is going to go on for, days, weeks, and he simply said, pretty vaguely to be honest, that the duration of this operation is defined by its effectiveness and its objectives. We are still hearing from Russian military officials here in Moscow this phrase that was first used by President Putin in that dawn address that he gave to the Russian nation, a special military operation. That gives the impression, doesn't it, of a targeted operation, some sort of limited operation in those 2 breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. Of course, according to the reports that we're getting out of the country, that we're getting from the Ukrainian government, you have explosions in Kiev, in the capital. As we were just hearing, you have the Ukrainian government claiming that columns of troops are crossing the borders at all sorts of different locations. So clearly, as far as Ukraine and the West are concerned, this is not a special military operation. This is a full-scale invasion.
Rosie, the European Union is set to hold an emergency meeting in Brussels. What's expected from this meeting?
Well, this certainly is held in emergency circumstances. All 27 EU leaders will be coming to Brussels for crunch talks. They'll be trying to plot out their next move on this most complex of geopolitical chessboard. And of course, people's lives are very much at risk here. For the European Union, as a geographical neighbour of Ukraine, what they'll also be thinking about is preparing for a potential refugee crisis. For example, Poland is one of those countries really on the front line there. They'll be thinking about that. They will also be preparing to ramp up sanctions against Moscow. The EU did earlier in the week unveil sanctions which were at the time perceived to be quite decisive, and having taken a step forward. Those sanctions included the Russian defense minister, they included the editor-in-chief of the broadcaster RT, but of course that has seemed to have not deterred the Russian government at all. So the European Union will be trying to plot out what it does next, preparing perhaps for Russian counter-sanctions. That's particularly relevant here in Europe, where there has been, in the past at least, a strong dependence on Russia when it comes to energy. So they'll be trying to work out how to mitigate the impact of potential counter-sanctions. And of course, that's where we might see some behind closed doors disagreement among EU member states. Each member state has its own industries. Each member state has its own key sectors of the economy which might or might not be targeted. So they'll be trying to weigh up among each other to see how best to move forward with this and how best to try and anticipate the next move from Russia, which of course the European Union simply does not know. And I think it would be a very brave analyst who would tell you where Russia is headed next, or where the Russian government plans its next move.
Indeed. Chris, the Prime Minister of Britain has called Vladimir Putin a dictator, and he's described his actions as hideous and barbaric. What is expected from London next?
Well, we heard from Prime Minister Boris Johnson earlier on in a statement made at Downing Street, and you're right, he described the actions by Putin as horrific, and he said in that statement that he'd spoken to President Zelensky of Ukraine and said that that Ukraine had the UK's backing. Boris Johnson said that the UK would do all it could to protect democracy and the people of European people's rights to dictate their own future. Now, speaking in that statement, he called upon sanctions, as we've mentioned previously. And before the G7 meeting began, he said this. He said, "Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy." Remember, there are already sanctions placed on Russian figures from the UK. There are those bureaucrats and banks. The hope is that more sanctions will halt a further Russian advancement into Ukraine. We also heard from Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party here in the UK. He said that Putin seeks division, so we must stand united. So the UK's stance is very clear. Russia must fail, and they're putting in place sanctions to make sure that perhaps becomes a reality.
Simon, final question. What do today's developments mean for Joe Biden? Is it being called another foreign policy failure? Because this is a man who had the front row seat during Georgia, during Crimea, and that clearly seems to have not prepared him to deal with Putin.
Palki, I don't think you can separate this situation that Joe Biden is facing from the botched military withdrawal in Afghanistan, which created so many unexpected questions about his national security credentials. The absolute last thing that this White House wants is for Republicans to be able to brand Joe Biden as the president who lost Ukraine. And already Republicans are out there doing that. Donald Trump was being interviewed on the Fox News channel last night, within minutes of the Russian invasion getting underway, insisting that none of this would have happened if he was still in the White House, and saying falsely to the American people, well, this is what happens when you get a rigged presidential election and a weak leader in charge. People like Vladimir Putin take advantage of him. So the White House cannot afford for Joe Biden to become the president on whose watch Ukraine was lost. But as we wait for the president to speak to the American public and the wider world later today, the question is, what is Joe Biden going to do to save Ukraine? What is he going to do to prevent it from slipping firmly back into Moscow's sphere of influence and control? And beyond sanctions, to that, the White House doesn't currently have an answer.
Right. Simon, Giles, Rosie, Chris, thanks very much for bringing us these updates from the capitals that are, as we say, shaping this conflict. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.